when I started the Endangered Alphabets project about 12 years ago, I was very surprised when David Crystal, whom some of you know and many of you know of, said to me, nobody that I know of anywhere in the world is studying script loss. And this was sufficiently new to me that I'd never even heard the phrase script loss. I had just coined this phrase, endangered alphabets. And at that point, I sort of plunged into what I was doing and, of course, I felt the world's alphabets could not possibly be in less qualified hands, given that I had no training in this kind of thing whatsoever. But about 10 years later, I started to ask myself belatedly, why? Why is nobody studying script loss? And at that point, I actually began writing my forthcoming book, Writing Beyond Writing. In the process of doing research for that, I came across an explanation for why the scholarly discipline of linguistics has sort of turned its back on writing as an art, as a tool, as a device, as a commodity, as a phenomenon, as an act of, as a gift, as an act of giving. And this explanation led me to Pippa Steele. It was from her book that she edited with her colleague Philip Boyes and a third party whose name I can't remember right now. After that, Pippa and I started meeting by Zoom, and every time we got together, we began realizing there was this really interesting thing happening, because her specialty being ancient scripts, which she was studying from some very interesting and unusual points of view, she was sort of, by definition, asking herself the question, why did these scripts lapse, fall out of use, be forced out of use, etc.? And we realized that we were both addressing the issue of script loss from opposite ends of time. So this is now an Einsteinian conversation that we're having. So it is absolutely my pleasure and delight to have Pippa Steele come and join us. And Pippa, I'd like you to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about the cruise project, and then we'll move on into the work that you're sort of segueing into right now.
Thank you so much, Tim, and that was a very kind introduction. And I want to thank you from the beginning, because yes, I've been working on ancient writing systems for a long time. When I started to come across these issues of writing system loss, script loss, the loss of writing traditions. So as I'll mention now, I'm very interested in writing as more than just a way of encoding language. I didn't know what was kind of going on so much in the modern world, and I slowly kind of started to find out more, and then finding someone who's actually working on this problem today that is much more widespread than we even think, writing traditions of various kinds being endangered or struggling to catch on. Those are serious issues that need to be tackled, and just to find out that there are so few people engaged in that directly, it was really striking for me. So I feel very lucky to have met Tim. Every time we have a conversation, I always come away buzzing with ideas. So it's already been a very fruitful collaboration. So what I'm going to do is I will share my screen, and apparently I can't share my screen. Hang
on just a sec. I made you co-host. You should.
It doesn't say I'm a co-host.
It unco-hosted you. Really? Ooh. There you go.
How rude.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen now. So yes, Endangered Alphabets ancient and modern. I very often say writing systems rather than alphabets, especially because I deal with a number of syllabic systems from the ancient world, as I'll mention. But alphabets, scripts, writing systems, in some ways it doesn't matter. It's all about the phenomenon of writing and what that means to people at various times. I'll just briefly introduce my two projects. So the one that was going for a long time, for 6.5 years, actually, from 2016 to last September, was the Cruise Project, context of and relations between early writing systems. So that was a European Research Council award. And the ideas behind that were basically to look at writing as something that is a socially contextualized practice. So people who work on writing systems of the ancient world very often think of writing systems as abstract means of encoding languages. And there are lots of people starting to work on other areas like the materiality of writing. But writing in its social context was really kind of underdeveloped when the Cruise Project came along. So, there were a few studies out there, but there wasn't very much and not much joined up thinking. So I like to think that the Cruise Project sort of led the way a little bit there in trying to get people to think about writing as, something that is a part of society, something that people in a society may come across every day, whether they're doing it or, seeing inscriptions in a central location or whatever. So the social context of writing was one aspect, and the other aspect was about how writing systems are related to each other. So particularly how a writing system might be adapted for a new language and a new social context. So again, not only thinking about that linguistic context, but the broader context too. And Cruise came to an end last year, as I said. We still have a website that has a lot of resources and publications. So if that is something that you're interested in, please do look out for the website. I can share some links after I've finished kind of presenting with my PowerPoint. Since then, I very luckily got a new grant, which would have been actually a European Research Council grant, but because of, the UK's position in Europe, ended up being a UKRI grant. So it's from basically the UK Research Council. And the new grant, the new project is Visual Interactions in Early Writing Systems. And that is running from October 22 to September 27. So it's going to be around for a while. And the ideas behind this are to think about the visual aspects of writing. So, for instance, how can we categorize the visual aspects of writing? How does a writing system that is very pictorial, like Egyptian hieroglyphs, compare with something that's very abstract looking, like the Phoenician or Greek or Roman alphabet, for instance? What difference do those visual features make? And then what is probably a bit more relevant here, how does writing exist as a part of visual culture, which could mean art, but it could mean part of the visible landscape? So as I said before, do you see writing around you? Is it something that you visually engage with? Can you read it? If you can't read it, do you still get some value from it? So there are various aspects there that I think we can think about in some quite complex ways. So, writing as a socially embedded and embodied practice is what I'm really interested in. So I've got two pictures here, one from ancient Egypt, where we can see hieroglyphs in a temple context. And you can see here that worship in a temple context is therefore something that means you're encountering writing, whether you can read that or not. Now, it's probably quite unlikely that there was a wide readership in the Egyptian world. But that doesn't mean that writing doesn't mean anything to people in that society. So, for instance, there are a lot of Egyptian hieroglyphs that also have a wider kind of iconographic currency. So I think you can probably see here some examples of the ankh, the symbol representing life. And, there are lots of others that will probably be meaningful, even if you can't read sequences of signs in the writing system. And there's also a decorative element as well. So imagine a society where you encounter writing visually a lot versus a society where you don't. So I work on Linear B, and as I'll explain in a moment, that's sort of one of the things I'm mainly working on at the moment. Now, Linear B is really restricted in its context of use, as far as we can tell. So you never have monumental inscriptions. You never have inscriptions that would be visible in the wider landscape. And we can be pretty sure that we haven't just lost that type of inscription, because they ought to be the most durable ones, if they're done on stone or that sort of material. So what does that mean for writing in that society? Well, the context is completely different. And that's one of the things I've learned over the years, is that writing in any given society has completely different contextual factors going on. And you have to pay attention to those contextual factors to really understand the place of writing in that society. I also wanted to mention, as you can see in the top right here, so writing is an embodied practice as well. It's something that you do physically, whether that's the modern world where you're hunched over your laptop typing on a keyboard, or it's the ancient world where, perhaps you're an administrator who writes on clay with a stylus, as in the picture. So that is me trying to recreate a Linear A tablet. You can tell I've cheated by spacing out the lines down the side before I write it. That's just because I was trying to sort of make a replica of that tablet. And you probably wouldn't do that as a real Linear A writer. But I do find that practical experiments can be really, really helpful for trying to just understand what the practice of writing is like. And, it's not all clay. So a lot of what I deal with might be writing on clay, but they're writing on so many different media with so many different instruments, with ink, or by making an impression, or by scratching with paint and so on. And all of those different processes are very different from each other, and imply, a different kind of writing that may be contextualized differently in different societies. Now, during the cruise project, what I want to just mention briefly as I go along is a couple of things that inspired my thinking when it came to looking at the modern world from my perspective in the ancient world. So in 2019, we had a conference called The Social and Historical Context of Historic Writing Practices, which was largely convened by my colleague Philip Boyes, with me kind of in a support role, as it were. And that covered a lot of ancient and medieval writing systems. So Greek, Egyptian, Mayan, cuneiform, runic, Ogham, Javanese. We had a really good wide range there. But we had an open call for papers, and we had proposals from some people who were working on the much more recent or modern world. And three here that really inspired me. So there was Aurélie Neveau, who was working on Bimo writing in Yunnan province in China. And you can see a picture of her here. She sort of showed us some of the oral practices that also surround writing, as well as kind of, the sort of physical practices. Cécile Guillaume-Pey on Sora writing in central India. And then Piers Kelly as well, who was working on recent emergent writing systems. So things like the Vi syllabary, the Caroline Islands script. So Vi continues in the modern day, but the Caroline Islands script is no longer in use. But that really interested me because it was the first time that I really became aware just how many writing systems are really recent creations trying to gain a foothold, as opposed to things that have been around for a very long time. So those three papers that were coming from really anthropologists working on writing in communities and kind of documented examples of writing systems, those were really, really influential on my thinking. So O'Reilly's paper on BMO writing particularly highlighted for me how, linguists may get frustrated by writing that is not nice and systematic, that doesn't have systematic kind of values for signs, or has a lot of paleographic, by which I mean sort of sign shape variation. But sometimes that's just part of the system. So in this particular writing tradition, there was a strong kind of master and pupil relationship and a strong emphasis on changing the system every time you get this transfer from master to pupil. And in fact, where there were efforts to teach it in kind of the modern schooling system, those efforts actually kind of backfired because they could only show something that is much more standardized than is the actual truth for the writing system. And that kind of means that, sometimes by trying to over standardize, you can kind of kill the social context of the writing practice. So, there's really a kind of delicate balance there. And Cecile was working on Sora writing, which again is a relatively recent invention, but very strongly bound up with social and religious practice, to the extent that the sort of potions were made and imbibed that involve kind of actually physically drinking the alphabet, which is sort of a really interesting kind of concept. And it opens your eyes when working on the ancient world, where we don't always have much anecdotal evidence for writing system use. And it sort of, makes you a bit more aware of what kinds of possibilities might be around, and all the things that you just may not have thought of that could be kind of possibilities for social reality. And these are really important examples, and also open my eyes to the modern world and actually what is happening with writing systems in the modern day. So what do I work on anyway? So I work on, as I said, Linear B and related systems in Greece and Cyprus. Now, I'll just focus on Linear B for now, which is the oldest writing system in which the Greek language is written. We call it a logosyllabic system. It has a syllabic base, so whenever you write out a word, you do that in syllabic signs. So these are two different tablets here, just one that I happen to have a photo of and one that I happen to have a drawing of. If you look at the drawing, you can see here person's name, ne, ke, se, u, something like Anexius, and a place name, Aka. And then there's a logogram here for male sheep and the number of male sheep held by that individual, 200. Now, as you can see from this sheep record, Linear B is very concerned with administration. And almost everything that survives from the Linear B writing world is on clay and it's administrative. And we just don't have evidence that writing was used more widely around the Mycenaean world. So this is what we call the Mycenaean period in Greece. So around 1450 to 1200 BCE. And as I said before, one of the things that's really striking is that it really seems to be confined to these administrative spheres. And that is very strange on the one hand, because, I think we're more used to seeing societies where writing might appear in various different contexts. If you look at the Greek alphabet that turns up around the 8th century BCE, you suddenly get graffiti, you get inscriptions on pots, inscriptions on statues, you get people writing in trade contexts, but they're also writing for pleasure. They're writing down bits of poetry or bits of erotic verse. And these are just all over the place. It's like this sudden explosion of writing in the 8th century BC. In Greece, how that compares with what you see for Linear B is really, really striking. And I suppose the main takeaway there is that I think the restriction of writing in Linear B has a lot to do with its vitality, because one thing that we know about Linear B writing is that it must have disappeared quite suddenly, and that was accompanied by things that we can prove archaeologically, so some quite catastrophic destructions of the administrative buildings and complexes where Linear B was used, mass depopulation of certain areas, all occurring around that 1200 BCE date. So, that looks very much as though the context of writing was the thing that was keeping it going, and once it's lost, the writing system is also lost. Now, I'm going to suggest that, these kinds of observations may have a takeaway for the modern world, as well as interest for studying the ancient world. So why do some writing systems of the ancient world die out? That's something I've been thinking about a lot recently, because I work a lot on writing systems that haven't survived to the modern day. If you think about Linear B and the Greek alphabet, well, Linear B has not survived to the modern day, but the Greek alphabet has. The Greek alphabet is alive and well. And, that those issues of how widely it's used, what kinds of uses it has, clearly are part of the picture there. Now, when you start investigating the concept of vitality, it's easy to just come up against frameworks that are designed for languages. Now, language and writing are closely linked with each other, but they're not the same thing. So while I'm very interested in language endangerment too, I wanted to try and present a framework that would look more closely at writing as a cultural tradition, as a practice, as something that can, to some extent, exist independently of language. If you think about it, you might expect everyone in a society more or less to be able to speak, but you don't necessarily expect everyone in a society to be able to write, or certainly not to the same degree. And literacy is not an all or nothing situation. Some people can be partially literate in all sorts of ways. And, that is part of a spectrum, really, not just sort of, can you write or not? So for assessing language endangerment, we might look at UNESCO's framework, though there are various other ones. UNESCO separates out these 9 points. So intergenerational language transmission, measuring the absolute number of speakers, the proportion of speakers within the total population. So is this a minority language or a majority language or what? And does it overlap with other languages? Shifts in domains of language use. So whether you use it at home, at work, if you use it in media, in publications, and so on. Response to new domains and media. So, does it appear on the internet, etc.? Availability of materials for language education and literacy is very important. one, because there are many speakers of endangered languages who do not have access to education in their own language, and that is a very serious point around the world. Governmental and institutional language attitudes and policies, including official status and use. So is a language being officially suppressed? Is it being supported? Is there a kind of state apathy towards it? Those are important questions. Community members' attitudes towards their own language, and type and quality of documentation, which is something linguists really care about, because if a language dies, they want to know what it sounded like before it goes, which is a sort of cynical way of putting it, but I think is kind of fair. Now, I wanted to look outside of language endangerment, and I found an interesting book by Catherine Grant on music endangerment. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because actually the structure of it is kind of based on language endangerment frameworks. But you can see that music as something that is practiced in society is quite different from language. So the four items that she picks out, the four main items, are systems of learning, the position or status of a tradition in the community, contexts and constructs, so sort of what's the attitude towards music in society, and where is it practiced and by whom, and so on, and infrastructure. So are there spaces to perform? Is collaboration possible? Is there access to media, to technology? So those are really important questions that don't all come up so much in language endangerment frameworks. And I was also looking, because I feel sure there must be some literature out there on kind of endangerment or vitality of cultural heritage, but I haven't found very much yet. So if anyone happens to know anything, I'm really looking for pointers in that area at the moment. I did find the Urban Institute, which does sort of city kind of planning and that kind of thing, and they were looking at measuring cultural heritage, so various artistic endeavours, to try and see sort of whether they were widespread in a society, whether they had kind of vitality, if you can measure how widely they're used or done, and so on. But I haven't found very much else at all. And here I also just want to mention something else that happened during the cruise project, which was a collaboration with a modern artist called Pico Rickleton, on a project that he called speculative syllabic. So he's a kind of speculative artist, and his idea was to imagine what might happen if the Cypriot syllabic writing system had survived to the modern day. Now, I've worked a lot on Cypriot writing, and the Cypriot syllabic system was very long-lived. It's closely related to Linear B. So if you were paying attention earlier, for instance, this sign, the se sign that we saw in that previous tablet, wait a minute, I'll show you here, is identical. Not all of the signs are identical, but we can see kind of how closely related the two systems are. And that system was used in Cyprus between about 1000 and about 200 BCE. So exactly the time when the Greek alphabet was in use for basically all other Greek-speaking areas. In Cyprus, they're like, no, we have this system already. We're happy with it, thanks. This lovely kind of syllabary, which is very visually distinctive. Doesn't represent Greek that well. It misses out a load of phonemes and things, but they have this great visual attachment to it. And it becomes a sort of symbol of Cypriot identity up until around the Ptolemaic period, around sort of the end of the 4th century BC onwards. That's when it kind of starts to disappear. But it's used on a very wide variety of media during that time. And I think the reasons for its disappearance are probably to do with the sudden loss of state support. So under the Ptolemaic dynasty, following the death of Alexander the Great, the island ends up under the rule of Ptolemy. And the Greek alphabet becomes the new official standard for writing official inscriptions. The Cypriot syllabary hangs on in the religious sphere, but eventually disappears. And that probably has to do with just sort of squeezing out the domains of its usage as time goes on, and people deciding to switch to, a writing system that is more globally popular, the Greek alphabet. And I should also say it was associated exclusively with the Cypriot Greek dialect. So it's a local system for people of Cyprus. Now, Pico's idea was, well, what if those things that brought about the sudden loss of vitality of the system had never happened, and the system carried on and was still in use to the modern day? So he indulged in various kind of experiments. So he made some fonts for the Cypriot syllabary to see what kinds of sort of visually distinctive realities it might have in the modern world. So this is his version of a kind of Comic Sans Cypriot syllabary. And I thought that was a really lovely kind of way of doing it, just to sort of see it like that. And he came up with various different sort of hypothetical situations in which the syllabary might appear. So here an open sign with the syllabary, various kind of signs, and he also had, as he collaborates with someone in Cyprus who tried some graffiti as well. And it's just this amazing experiment that absolutely opened my eyes to this idea of, vitality is such an interesting concept in the existence of writing systems. If you try to imagine this alternative history, what might that mean? What kinds of circumstances could we imagine in which this writing system could have continued to the modern day? So that was really eye-opening for me. And actually, there are modern Cypriots who kind of know about the script and sort of still think about it as something very distinctive of Cyprus, though it's not at all in use. But occasionally you'll see it turn up on like an album cover or something like that. So, it's not been completely removed from Cypriot identity. Now, I've got a few more slides, but I don't know if we want to sort of stop here or if I should say a bit more. I don't know, Tim, what do you think? I was going to just introduce where I think my kind of work might be able to help your kind of work and the Endangered Writing Network. Do you want me to come in with that now, or do you want to chat?
So my thinking is let's leave that for the wrap up toward the end.
Okay.
So pausing you where you are, this is really great. And one of the many notes that I wrote down when you were talking had to do with the fact that one of the few ways, as you yourself have pointed out, in which linguists talk or think about writing systems or scripts is by typology. In other words, they look at the ancestry of the script. And in fact, if you go to a Wikipedia page that is specifically about a script, there is this tab over on the right, which is specifically about the ancestry of the script. And that way of thinking, it strikes me as being very vertical. In fact, literally, when you look at the page, the Wikipedia page, it's very vertical. You've got the Brahmic script leads to this, leads to this. And one of the things that I think your contextual view of writing does is it encourages us to think horizontally. And I'll explain what I mean with an example of a script that I was actually writing about this morning in a cafe in Plattsburgh, New York. and that is the Pollard script for one of the Hmong languages in China, where Hmong is typically referred to as Miao. So this example, I think, gives a great illustration of how if you think only of the particular culture in which the script is being used, and you don't look sideways, then you really don't understand much either about the development or the decline of that script. And I'll tell you about this because this is so fresh in my mind. So Samuel Pollard was a missionary. He went out to China towards the end of the 19th century. And he made contact with a number of different peoples, but at one point he was in the city, and this was just around 1904, and five representatives of the Miao people came to see him. Now, they came to see him because they had heard of his work, especially with the Yi, and that they knew that he was sympathetic towards minorities. But here's the point. Coming to the city for them was an extremely dangerous occupation, because as elsewhere, the Hmong were viewed with such contempt and disdain as an outsider people who, by the way, were outsiders because the Han Chinese had driven them out of their lands some centuries previously. And in the process, according to Hmong tradition, they had lost their writing, which is another great thing that Piers Kelly writes about really well, by the way. Anyway, so, and in fact, another representative had come to the city to see Pollard a couple of years previously, but was so afraid he had left without meeting him. So straight away, this is really interesting situation for the birth of a script. Pollard, who, like James Evans, was a very sympathetic with the underdog, discussed with these Hmong representatives the possibility of their learning the Chinese script. And it was just too complicated because these are people who did not read and write at all. Equally, he looked at the Latin-based orthography that was being promoted by his own church, and it was not phonetic enough. You know, anything Latin-based is not phonetic enough, right? There's no tone markings, all this kind of stuff. And so he decides, I'm going to create a script that these people can use and understand, which is sort of an extraordinary thing in itself. And to some extent, I think it probably put him at odds with his church. Here's the next thing. The reason why the Hmong was so, or the Miao was so eager to meet him and to have their own script was because of this cultural narrative that centuries before, they had been driven out of their homelands by the Chinese, and in the process, they had lost their writing. One version of the tale is that it was written on leather, and it had been eaten by their horses. Another version was that it was in books, and that had been lost in crossing a river, all these things. But the tradition, these narratives, always ended with, and one day, somebody will come from heaven and give us writing. And here is this missionary who's turning up, not with one of their religions, but with a Christian religion, and offering them writing. And that's something that I think, you know, if that hadn't been documented, you would never have thought of that as being a reason why a culture that had previously been strictly oral would go wham and would glom on to writing, would learn it so avidly and so quickly. But you then, this is all happening between 1904 and 1936. But what happens after the Second World War, of course, is that the presence of Christian missionaries in China starts getting dramatically reduced. And the Chinese government decides that they want to, and this is still a practice of theirs, they want to control what script their minorities use. And so they produce a Romanized version. Before that, they produced a Pinyin version. And Pollard's script started to be called Old Miao. And so by the end of the 20th century, early 21st century, you have this really interesting situation where you have one researcher who goes there and says, there are only 3 villages where this script is still used, and only among the Christians in those villages. So the religion, which had been serving as a vehicle, as a protector of this script and as a purpose for this script, was now shrinking in its reach. And so the number of people who were still using it for that purpose was shrinking. Meanwhile, the Chinese government put out a statement saying that 200,000 Miao are Christians, and therefore everything is fine in the Miao community. Nothing about whether they use the Pollard script. So what you have there is this sort of extraordinary illustration of how you have a vulnerable population. Because after all, when a writing system is adopted or is lost, you usually have a vulnerable population. The example you gave of like cataclysms and just widespread destruction is just like a physical version of the same thing. And they're extraordinary hopes for writing. For them, it's a millenarian thing but when they get their writing back, they will get their lost kingdom back. But of course, what's happening is that all of this is being influenced by a colonial / religious power, namely the Christian church. Then you get another major power coming in from the other side, the Chinese Communist government, and influencing them in a very, very different way. So I love the idea that by thinking of writing in its context, you also get the chance to look sideways and you see, what else is going on in these people's lives. And I'm delighted that you're thinking of these terms into looking at these early writing systems, because, as you said, you've got so little evidence to go on. So how do you go about trying to find this sort of contextual life for the scripts that you've been studying?
Thank you. And that's a great example and opens up so many interesting issues. Yeah, so looking for those contextual factors can sometimes be difficult for the ancient world. Depends a little bit on what kinds of documentation we have, what kinds of texts survive from particular societies. So, some will be very descriptive. If you're looking at the Roman world and you want to know about literacy, there are various writers who will just give you their opinions straight. But the Roman world has very widespread literacy. It has this dominant writing system, not too much variation, even though there's a lot of linguistic variation. And if you're looking at societies in the Bronze Age, like Linear B, if you're looking at the Cypriot syllabic system, very often you're drawing that contextual information from archaeological remains, from sort of anthropological approaches to research, often without that kind of anecdotal evidence. But there's often a lot we can do to kind of try and reconstruct the broader framework. So, one thing that I really learned from Philip Boyce's research on my cruise project was that in a place like Ugarit, okay, so Ugarit was a Bronze Age kingdom dominated by a single city, though it probably controlled a wider hinterland. In fact, it certainly did. It was a kind of Mediterranean power that was, it was talking to Egypt, to the Hittite Empire, to probably Greece and Cyprus, and so on. So it's kind of a political player around the Mediterranean. but this is in Syria. It's an area where the local language would have been a Northwest Semitic language, so basically related to Hebrew, Phoenician, and so on. But in the Bronze Age, so a bit earlier than attested Phoenician and Hebrew. And on the one hand, they have this local language. On the other hand, when they write, mainly what they do is to borrow cuneiform traditions from Mesopotamia, to the extent that a lot of their administration is written in Akkadian, which is the language of Mesopotamia itself. So, this is not something that's local, it's something that has just become a kind of wider standard. Right. And when they write to other powers around the Mediterranean, they do that in Akkadian cuneiform usually as well. So on the one hand, there's this sort of kind of writing culture that is very much based on, global, not exactly colonial, but on this kind of global idea of, what might be useful to write in terms of both the system and the language. We know at the same time that the Phoenician alphabet is around, so the very earliest attestations of that alphabetic tradition come from several hundred years earlier, and we know that tradition is around, that it's a kind of linear alphabet. The linear alphabet doesn't turn up in Ugarit, but what they do is they develop this cuneiform hybrid. So it's cuneiform as in wedges on clay, so it looks visually a bit like Akkadian, but the signs are less complex, and it just has this small repertoire of signs. So rather than a logosyllabic repertoire of hundreds of signs, it just has a repertoire of around 22 signs, or up to 27, depending on which sort of version of the Ugaritic alphabet it is, because they have a couple of borrowed signs as well. But they've created this thing that's a hybrid between kind of local ideologies. This is to represent our local language. It sort of visually bridges the cuneiform tradition and the linear tradition by having this set of signs that is quite similar to the linear Phoenician alphabet. So it's really, really interesting, actually, just to see how, and what you said earlier about not looking vertically but looking horizontally. So you couldn't classify this script as a descendant of Mesopotamian cuneiform or a descendant of the linear Phoenician alphabet. This is just what some people at Ugarit decided to do to represent their kind of local interests by picking two different traditions and kind of blending them. And it's really interesting, but we can see that at the same time, often they're having to assert themselves politically against all these kind of greater powers around the Mediterranean, that there's various kind of argy-bargy in different places. And you can see that's all part of this sort of who are we locally and how do we fit in globally? And it's really interesting, but, we don't have that much anecdotal evidence, but once you piece together what you know of kind of where the writing comes from and so on, this narrative just really clearly emerges.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think what I'm going to do is to say it's now 12:52. Let's do 5 minutes of questions, because there are people I know in this group who they're sitting on their hands right now. And then you and I'll do a wrap up and talk about the work that you're moving into and collaborations that you and I are thinking of doing. So I have no idea how to handle the hand up thing. So if you have questions, then just jump in and ask them.
I see the system won't let me turn on my video right now. It's like once you've started recording, you can't turn your video on, but never mind. I just had an observation, this idea of, languages or writing systems being influenced by those around them. The Syriac language variety of Aramaic, was written in a consonantal alphabet. Well, around the, I don't know, 10th to 11th centuries of the Common Era, there was, Greek was widely known among the Syriac educated people. So one writer decided to try to invent vowel symbols to just go in line right with the consonants. There are various systems of dots or Greek vowels written very tiny above or below the line. This guy decided to come up with inline full vowels. It didn't take off. No one was interested. It's like it just looked too weird, I think, to most Syriac speakers. And so basically it was born and died with this one man. The name doesn't come to me right off. But anyway, that was it. An aerial influence which simply didn't sit well with the native speakers.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. And there are various examples of that sort of thing sort of spattered across time, where you see some inventions that just don't catch on, and some where, I mean, if you look at that original transmission of a consonantal Phoenician alphabet to Greek speakers who have words like ayaya or a, or words that only consist of vowels and really would struggle. So sometimes linguistics does help us a little bit to understand why particular decisions are made, but it doesn't always, which is interesting. And it's the usual instinct is, I think, for linguists to try to understand why you have this change of like adding those vowel signs from the perspective of representing language. So like I said, vowel only words, lots of words that begin with a vowel where you need to know which vowel it begins with and so on. Phoenician doesn't come up against those problems as often. So this is all about phonology, right? It's about the inventory of signs in a system. It's about how morphology works in that system too. Will you get lots of confusion if you don't route the vowels? Well, yeah, I think that's a big part of the story, but it's not all of it, because this is an alphabet that is not solely designed for Greek. It actually catches on in Anatolia, in Italy as well. So maybe via Greek kind of mediators and so on, but not exclusively via Greek mediators. So the Phrygian alphabet in Anatolia is attested before the Greek alphabet. And these are Indo-European languages largely, so maybe they have similar kind of phonological issues going on. But at the same time, there seems to be a sudden explosion of kind of popular writing on kind of lots of different media that happens as much in the Cypriot syllabic script as it does in the Greek alphabet at pretty much exactly the same time. This all becomes suddenly archaeologically visible, in this incredible period when writing is just becoming really popular. And you can see how, as soon as someone's kind of invented this script, it doesn't matter if it has the symbols you need or not. What matters is that this is the system everyone is using, and it catches on and it spreads like wildfire. And, I think that's sort of not surprising from a cultural point of view. This is kind of to be expected in a sense.
But also on the micro scale, you have a situation with the Thai scripts in Southeast Asia, where the Thai scripts have many of the letters have a loop at the bottom, and it seems as if one scribe decided to fill that in and turn the loop into a dot. And so there's now one whole tradition there where the Thai scripts have the filled in loop and the dot rather than not. And it may well have been that just because so few people were actually writing, that actually was the result of one person. Do we have one more question before we move on to the final phase?
Yeah, right. Of course.
Yes, Olesh.
Yeah, I would like just to, it's really interesting because it really depends on this I guess, social needs or social area in which the script is used, the way it is used, how it is spread, and how it is transferred. But my question, or maybe, did you consider the similarity between what happens in the Mediterranean with what is happening in the scenographic sphere, the Chinese script area? Because there is a lot of things that, for example, very simple, very similar to what you would call, what you show in Linear B, is actually happening in the Japanese writing system. Because you've got logographic use, and then you've got syllabic use, and so on. And one of our colleagues, I'm from the Silent Symbol Research Group, one of our colleagues called that kind of system as an open system because it incorporates a lot of outside elements. It's one of a really interesting flow of scripts in the scenographic sphere. You've got strong square characters, you've got the ones you mentioned, the BMOR or Yi characters, and so on. It's a very interesting area that you may find some really similarities.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not in any way an expert on the sinographic sphere. So my interests there have been largely very, very amateurish, but I'm certainly very interested. And I've been looking a little bit recently at both kind of early, like the earliest Chinese writing and how that seems to develop. And, those sort of early stages where you don't really get the pictography stage that everyone says that you should do. You go quite directly to what look like real kind of characters, but there does seem to be archaeological evidence for some kind of precursors being around, which I've been really interested in recently. I think the development of Japanese is so interesting as well, because we see this amazingly complex system. It's fantastic, and reminds me very much of some systems in the ancient world that people say are just so complicated that nobody could possibly keep this up without a professional interest in it. So like Mesopotamian scribes or Egyptian scribes learning very complex writing systems. And then you look at something like Japanese, and that sheer kind of combination of different origins of signs, and then what you do in terms of using kanji and then kana, and how you specify both morphology and particular sounds and so on. And it's just it looks so complicated to an outsider. I've never learned it, so I think without learning it, you never really understand it fully, and that's something I aspire to one day, but haven't found time for yet.
Here's an interesting analogy. So during Shakespeare's day, south of the river in Southwark, that was where all of the dregs and the passers through and transients ended up. And supposedly, if you went to an inn in Southwark, you could use pretty much any currency from any currency using country in the world that would show up there, because you had to. And if you're working in the pub, and you've got the equivalent of cash register in your mind, this number of reals is roughly equal to this number of florins or whatever. They managed it. Okay, we're running out of time. So Pippa, tell us about your newest enterprise and how you might invite people who are in the group today to get involved.
Thank you. So this will just take me probably about 5 minutes. I'm going to share a link in the chat just so that you can follow that, and I'm just going to share my screen again. Okay, so what I sort of wanted to work towards is, well, can these insights from the worlds of pre-modern writing systems actually do some good in the modern day? And that was basically my idea. So there are people in the modern day, not enough, but there are some who are interested in trying to revitalize or to protect or maintain endangered writing traditions, and often along with them either endangered languages or minority languages or indigenous languages. So can my kind of research on the ancient world maybe contribute to that conversation and to thinking of ways in which we might be able to support struggling or underrepresented traditions in the modern day and the languages that go along with them? I'm certainly interested in the languages too. So I'm launching a new venture called the Endangered Writing Network, and there's a screen cap from the page that I put a link to in the chat. I've got a sort of action plan in mind, but what I really want to do is to bring people together to talk. So the action plan goes, I feed in research from my current project. I look for others working on the ancient or the pre-modern world to try to get together more observations on pre-modern writing traditions and why they sometimes died out. Secondly, we create fora for discussion. So we bring together people who might be working on these things from an academic perspective. So that might be linguists, it might be anthropologists, but not only academics. I want language activists, typographers, artists, particularly members of affected communities. I want this to be a conversation between lots of different people who have a stake in these outcomes. So this is going to be my big task for the next few years or so, just trying to bring these people together to talk more. And then number 3, raising awareness, which can be done in various sorts of ways. 4, kind of the outcomes of the discussion. So collaborations, trying to devise new strategies for maintaining writing traditions. You know, where does this input from the research lead? And finally, and most importantly, I'd like to work directly with communities to find out where kind of help can directly go, and how it can be most effective, because, you know, it feels almost well, a little bit arrogant to think that, you know, oh well, I can help people in the modern day with my work on ancient writing systems. But now that I've started to see all these links, I really hope that, you know, there's potential there. And I've got a launch event for the Endangered Writing Network, which is happening on Friday, the 24th of February. Everyone is welcome to that. It's by Zoom. It's, you know, you can't cater to all time zones, but there'll be a recording as well. I'm just going to finish off by saying, well, okay, so what do I think ancient writing systems have to tell us? Some of the points are really obvious and we know them already. So education is important for writing. Literacy levels are important for the vitality of a system. State support can bolster vitality, but state hostility or apathy can destroy it. And writing requires access to basic materials. Okay, so far so obvious. Less obvious things though. So there can be really strong and lasting ideological connections between a writing system and the identity of a society using it that completely transcend whether it's well designed for the language or not. So the Cypriot syllabary is one system that tells you that. Visibility plays an important role in vitality. So, you know, in order for a writing system to be used, it needs to be seen. And that's very important in society. The social context of and attitudes towards writing are very important. So what's writing for? Who can or should do it? What's the power of writing? And those questions depend on the answers of that society. You know, it's not something where you can just say, oh, well, this is what writing is for. There is no one answer to that. Every society has its own answer to that. And then the more varied the uses of writing, the higher the vitality. So we can see that from the Greek alphabet, as I've mentioned. So a few starting thoughts on what this might mean for feeding into kind of efforts to protect modern endangered writing traditions. Community buy-in and interest is really crucial. So how can we foster that? Visibility can increase vitality. So how do we think about writing in the wider visible landscape? Not just, are we writing textbooks in this, but, does it exist elsewhere? Signs are a really nice example, for instance. And that's something that, but you do see kind of catching on in some societies where particularly endangered or minority languages kind of, if they get some state support, they might get road signs and things as well. Technological support needs to be comprehensive. So it's not just, does this have Unicode, but can it be used on a whole range of devices? Does it have a range of available fonts? Can you change the visual appearance of this system when you write it down? Can you make a fancy poster with, a different kind of visual form of the script? And really, really crucial is that I think there's often, where there's a writing tradition and domains may be traditionally restricted, there's a choice between trying to revitalize within the traditional domains and trying to expand the domains into new media like the internet, publications, and so on. And the big question is that change welcome? Because, you can say, we need to get this out on the internet and everything all you like, but if the community doesn't support that, then it's no use to the community. So community needs, I think, are central here. But I just wanted to sort of go over those points quickly. I will stop sharing now. Thank you very much for listening. That was the one bit where I wanted to sort of hit home with what I think might happen with my Endangered Writing Network ideas. The moment it's all, there's lots of blue sky thinking as well as academic research in there. But I very much hope that, this will lead to something material. Thank you for all these comments in the chat as well, which I am going to just save a copy of as well.
This is wonderful because so many of the things you illustrate are the things we're working on as well, such as our Red List project and the Script Incubator project. So rather than take up any more time now, I'm actually going to put some stuff about those in the email that I send out to everybody who registered for the talk, that goes along with the link to the recording, so you can share that with other people too. All right, Pippa, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for putting such a comprehensive and interesting talk together. I'm sure you and I are going to be talking many times. So I'll see you, in fact, on the 24th at that talk. Yeah, right?
Yes, absolutely. I should have said that Tim is doing a spot at the launch event for the Endangered Writing Network, for which I'm very grateful.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Okay. Thanks again to everybody for joining us. This has been recorded. I'm going to stop the recording in just a second. And we will send out the link so you can share it with other people who might be interested. Hope to see you all again soon. And we'll be in touch with information about future conversations. Thanks. Take care.